Hello everyone. So I have decided to start a series on British English literature. Now this is going to help anybody who is studying English literature in their graduation, who is studying English literature in their post-graduation, or anyone who is going to give any competitive exam after their graduation for the post-graduation. So we'll be dealing with the ages, we will be dealing with the writers of those ages, we will be dealing about the entire conversation about what happened around that age and who were the main writers, what were their main works. So we'll be talking about that in brief. So today I'm going to start with the first one. I will be reading you some brief points, and then where it will be required to be talked in detail, I'll be talking about that in detail. So let's start with this. I hope you will like it. So now, as we know the chronology of English literature, we have the Old English period, then we have the Elizabethan period. After Elizabethan period, we have James I of England. Then we know that printing press came with William Caxton. Then we had the Act of 1642. Then after that we had the Renaissance period. So now we are going to start with the Renaissance period. Let's start with this. The Renaissance period, it spanned from 1485 to 1660. Now, John Milton, we all know, those who would be studying it in their graduation, they would be knowing about John Milton. John Milton was a very famous name of the Renaissance period. He was called the last Renaissance poet of the England. Now in the Renaissance period spans for a very long time, as I told you, from 1485 to 1660. Now we'll be dealing with what came in the Renaissance period one by one. We had the Tudor period, which was from 1485 to 1550. Now in Tudor period, we had William Tyndale, who translated Greek New Testament into English. Now we all know that there was a lot of influence, lot of Greek influence in English literature. So a lot of translations happened from Greek and Spain. So here we know that William Tyndale, he translated Greek New Testament into English. Then we had a very famous name, Miles Coverdale, who published first complete English Bible, which is famously called as Coverdale Bible, which came in 1535. Thomas Cranmer, he published the Book of Common Prayer to enable widespread knowledge of the Word of God. Now we all know that in the beginning era of the Renaissance period, there was a lot of interest of people in reading the books of God. Since printing press, it came late. So after printing press came into being, then people were able to access the books of God. They were able to access the Bible. Then we had from 1549 to 1552, the English nation was furious with Thomas Cranmer for substituting the Latin version of liturgy with English one, because Thomas Cranmer, he translated the Book of Common Prayer and he wanted people to know more about the Word of God. Now we have another most famous writer, Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, which is called as a perfect example of Renaissance humanism. Now let's read about Renaissance poetry. Let's discuss about Renaissance poetry. I'll be giving you some short points on that. In the Renaissance poetry, we had women who were idealized. They were upper class, elite and aristocratic in tone and style. The tone of the writing and the characters were formally and courtly. Lady portrayed as fickle, and because of the fickle mindedness of the ladies, it caused a lot of pain to the male members of the society, which was projected in the writings. Poetry of the Renaissance age used dream allegory. Writing poetry or verse became a marker of class. Now Renaissance poetry was courtly, formal and highly stylized in form. We had Thomas White and Henry Howard, which was the Earl of Surrey. These were the famous poets of Renaissance age. We also had blank verse, which was brought by Henry Howard into being. Now let's talk about the satirists of the Renaissance age. They were John Skelton and John Heywood. These are very important names, John Skelton and John Heywood, the satirists of the Renaissance age. Now we also come across the mystery plays, which came into being in the 15th century, and these were performed between the months of May and June. It told us about the Christ life, which was the main theme of the mystery plays, because as I told you, during the Renaissance, a lot of influence was taken from the Bible. People wanted to read more about God, because before printing press came into being, as I told you, printing press, it came in 1422. After 1422 it came, after William Caxton brought it into being. So people were unaware about what was written in the Bible. It was just told to them by the priest. So now the books on Bible, the books told about God, they were very, very famous among people. People enjoyed reading it. Then we had the coming of interlude. Interlude came with John Haywood, who was a very important person of this genre. Now, what is an interlude? Interlude, it has comic subplots and parodies of the main theme. The examples of interludes are Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Now here in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, we had Dream, which provides an example with villagers performing Paramus and Thisbe, which was an interlude. Now John Haywood had 4 P's. John Haywood, the same person who popularized interlude, now he had 4 P's in his writing. In his 4 P's, it was a work. 4 P's. The 4 P's. It was a debate among peddler, apothecary, palmer, and pardoner. Now we'll come to the Elizabethan period, which was from 1558 to 1603. Now again, it comes into the English Renaissance period. We were talking about the Tudor period. Then we talked about mystery plays. Then we talked about how John Haywood brought interlude, and then we come to the Elizabethan period. Now Elizabethan period is famously it spans from 1558 to 1603. Now during the Elizabethan period, we had the use of instructional pamphlets on etiquette and morals. So a lot of emphasis was made on the morals, on instructions, and these pamphlets were satiric in tone. Philip Sidney. Now whenever we are going to talk about the Elizabethan period, we have to talk about Sidney, Spencer. These were very famous names, and other names which are going to come forward as we are going to go through the lecture. Now Elizabethan period, it used a lot of pamphlet forms. As I told you, they were satiric in tone. Philip Sidney, the most important work of Philip Sidney, which is mostly taught to us in our graduation period, that is an apology for poetry, which was written in 1595. Now, an apology for poetry, it asserts the supremacy of poet over nature. Poet is not interested in analyzing nature, but in transcending it. So now here in Philip Sidney's work, An Apology for Poetry, he says that poet is above poetry, and poet wants to transcend what is taught by nature. So poet is above, according to him, poet was above the nature. Now admonition tracts. Now let's talk about the admonition tracts. What were those tracts? These were the pamphlets attacking the bishops and defending Presbyterian faith. They were circulating during those periods. Now, as I told you, bishops, people before printing press came into being, bishops, they had a very strong position in the society, because what were told by the bishop to the people, that was the word of God. But after printing press came into being, after printing press, the books, the pamphlets, they were circulated in the society, and especially during the Elizabethan period. Before the Elizabethan period, there were a lot of pamphlets, there were a lot of plays which were performed. So things started coming into the paper form, but these will be the book form will be there in the future as we are going to read forward. So now the supremacy of the bishop, now these were being challenged by the writers. They wanted to tell people what is taught to them in the Bible, and they should not believe bishop over the book, over the Bible. So now admonition tracts, these were those tracts which were attacking the bishops. Now Elizabethan fiction. Now let's talk about how Elizabethan fiction looked like during the Elizabethan period. Now in the Elizabethan fiction, we have love, marriage, courtship. A lot of satire was made on the London life and corruption. There was lack of faith, moral depravity, many kinds of romances came into being. Now during the Elizabethan period, we see a lot of romances. These were the pastoral, the courtly, the middle class romance. Themes of the themes of honor and chivalry, courage, courtly fiction, romance, tale, adventure, they came into being. Now we have another most famous name during the Elizabethan period, that was John Lilly, who wrote Euphrates, which was published in 1578. Another writer, Robert Greene, he was the most prolific writer of Elizabethan age. Now let's talk about another work of Philip Sidney. After An Apology for Poetry, another work that he wrote was Arcadia. Now Arcadia, the inspiration of Arcadia was taken from Italian work Sfornaro's Arcadia. Now let's talk about the late Tudor and Elizabethan poetry. How was Elizabethan poetry in nature? It continues to be under the influence of Homer, Virgil, and other classical poets. Now, because during the early age of the British period, we had a lot of Latin writers, we had a lot of Greek writers. So now these Elizabethan poets, they were taking inspiration from the early classical poets. Now another work of Philip Sidney, that was Astrophil and Stella, which was written in 1582. Now Astrophil and Stella, it was a collection of 108 sonnets and 11 songs. Now another poet which comes into our mind after Philip Sidney, another very important poet of the Elizabethan age, was Edmund Spenser, who wrote Amorety. Amorety was published in 1595. Now Edmund Spenser also wrote The Shepherd's Calendar, which was published in 1579. It is a very talked about work of Edmund Spenser, The Shepherd's Calendar. Now, he wrote this work when he was just 27 years old. In this work, he had 12 eclogues. Now, what were there in those 12 eclogues? The 4 eclogues were regarding the matters of religion and conduct, 4 deals with love, 1 in praise of Elizabethan, 3 1 was in lamentation, 1 was written for singing a match. Now, Queen Elizabeth was called as Elisa in The Shepherd's Calendar. Another work that Edmund Spenser wrote was Epithalamium. Now, Epithalamium was a 24-stanza poem which represents 24 hours of a midsummer's day. Prothalamion, which he wrote after Epithalamium, it was published in 1596. It celebrates marriage of Elizabeth and Lady Catherine Somerset, daughter of Earl of Worcester. Now Spenser wrote Faerie Queene, which was a moral allegory. Now Spenser in Faerie Queene, he took the inspiration from chivalric romances of the medieval period. As I told you, they were inspired from the Greek writers, they were inspired from all the Latin writers, basically all the medieval writers, all the classical writers. So Spenser in his Faerie Queene, he was inspired by the medieval period writers. Now another person who is very important during the Elizabethan period was Sir Walter Raleigh. He wrote The History of the World, which was published in 1614. Now let's talk about the features of the Elizabethan drama. How was Elizabethan drama in nature? Now the comedies, the comedy dramas, they took inspiration from Italy and France. History plays and chronicles were common. Tragedy took Seneca as model. So whatever Elizabethan tragedy were written, the model of the tragedy was taken from Seneca. Another a classical writer, a medieval writer. Tragedy is concerned with the darker side, melancholic aspect of human life, like Jacobean period. So we are going to read that in the future lessons, how Jacobean drama was in nature. It was basically full of bloodshed. So that was seen during the drama of the Elizabethan period too. Now we talked about the mystery plays which happened in 15th century. And the mystery plays, they started to diminish in nature. They started to wane in popularity and had Catholic themes, but it was waning in popularity. Now after mystery plays came up morality plays. When we talk about comedies, we had the comedies of Terence and Plautus. Now another most famous name is Thomas Kyd. He wrote the Spanish tragedy, a very famous line of Spanish tragedy. It was again a tragedy of bloodshed. It was a tragedy of ruthlessness. A very famous line of Thomas Kyd, the Spanish tragedy was, "You blinked an eye, you missed a murder." Now, a very famous popular dramatist after Thomas Kidd was Christopher Marlowe. Now, Dr. Faustus, we all know about Dr. Faustus. We must have read in our graduation. So Thomas Kidd, after Thomas Kidd, the person who was very famous in popularity was Christopher Marlowe. Now, Christopher Marlowe, he wrote Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, Jew of Malta. Now let's talk about another very famous person who needs no introduction at all, but is very frequently asked in all the papers of the graduation entrance exam, of maybe your post-graduation entrance exam. So it's a very famous name, that is William Shakespeare. Now his time period is from 1564 to 1616. Shakespeare presents he presents more complete characters than ever seen before in the English stage. So by complete characters, I mean that Shakespeare, he showed characters in all its spirits. He used to show all the sides of the characters, the humorous side of the characters, the cunning side of the character, the dark side of the character. Now, audience can identify with the character because they believe that they are just one of them. So he used to create a very relatable character in his plays. Now, the first published play of Shakespeare was Titus Andronicus. Shakespeare comedy belonged to the early phase and tragedy to the later phase. King Henry VIII was his last tragedy play. So the first published play of Shakespeare was Titus Andronicus, and the last tragedy of Shakespeare was King Henry VIII. Shakespeare's tragedies were Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Othello. Now Othello came in the Jacobean phase. Now as we are reading the Shakespearean phase, it came in the Renaissance period, but the later tragedies of the Shakespeare, the later tragedies written by the Shakespeare, it came during the Jacobean period. So after the Renaissance period, we see a transition from the Renaissance period to the Jacobean period. So now this later tragedies of Shakespeare, they came in the Jacobean phase. Shakespeare's darker period was the Jacobean period. In the Jacobean period, we see human jealousy, distrust, vulnerability, revenge. Now, the plays which were written during the Jacobean period, as I told you, Jacobean period was a period where a lot of bloodshed happened in the plays, a lot of treachery happened, a lot of moral corruption happened, and the plays which were written during the Jacobean era were The King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra. Now, Shakespeare plays were popular because of a strange mixture of conventional themes and subversive politics. Shakespeare dealt with human imperfections, ego, and problematic personalities. He developed a complete human character in his plays. England has consistently projected itself as the land of Shakespeare. His work has contributed to the making of England's identity. So England, it calls itself as a land of Shakespeare. England is known by the name of Shakespeare. He has had so much influence during the era of the British literature. The Jacobean period. Now we are going to talk about the Jacobean period. Shakespeare wrote his last tragedies, his most famous tragedies during the Jacobean era, but we must know what is a Jacobean era. Jacobean era, it spanned from 1603 to 1624. Now Marlowe and Shakespeare preferred colloquial speech for their characters. Now Marlowe and Shakespeare, these playwrights, they loved writing colloquial speech. Colloquial speech, by that we mean the speech which was spoken just like normal people speak in their dialogue with each other. Now they were interested in the psychology of characters. Now all the dramas that you will witness written by the Shakespeare, they had some psychological tangent to its characters. Now features of the Jacobean prose, which again the Jacobean era, it spanned from 1603 to 1624. Now writers became interested in science and learning. Virtue, evil, faith, human corruption were the subjects of the prose. Increasing interest in geography, pamphlets, lengthy prose works were written during the era. King James I, ruler after Queen Elizabeth, himself wrote pamphlets, so he himself was interested in writing, and theological treatises. Francis Bacon was often called Renaissance man. 17th century brought biographies and autobiographies to the fore. Most important preacher of the Jacobean era was John Donne. Now John Donne, the Renaissance period had both pastoral poetry indebted to Edmund Spenser and Jacobean poetry that had metaphysical as John Donne. Now, metaphysical poetry, by that we mean the poetry which talked about geography. It linked geography and science in its poetry. It was written in a way which became a little tricky for the readers to understand. It had a lot of depth to it. We're going to discuss about that in detail in the future lectures. Features of Spenserian poetry. Now we talked about Philip Sidney. Now we're going to talk about the features of Spenserian poetry, which was written by Edmund Spenser. Now it had pastoral theme, idealized golden age of England, wrote political, moral, religious allegories like Spenser's The Faerie Queene. Now, features of Spenser poetry. We are going to talk about that in detail. The Spenserian pastoral poetry might have been influenced by Joshua Sylvester and all the other points that we discussed before. It was pastoral in theme. It idealized the golden age of England, and it had moral and religious allegories to it. Now, features of metaphysical poetry. Now, metaphysical poetry, as we just the term we just used a few minutes back, metaphysical poetry was written by John Donne. Now, let's talk about the features of metaphysical poetry. It was pastoral in theme. Spenserian pastoral poetry might have been influenced by